Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Church of Grace. My name is Patrick Hayes, and today is Friday, December 13th. It's Friday the 13th? I didn't even realize that until now. We are going over Matthew. We are in Matthew part 50. Don't look for chapter 50. It's not there. We're in the 50th part of this series in the book of Matthew. So open your Bible up to Matthew chapter 23, and we're going to jump in. So let's read Matthew chapter 23. And we're going to start in verse 34. We're going to read to the end of the chapter, and then we will go over the Bible a verse at a time. Now, if you're new to this Bible study, I'm going to ask you guys questions, so don't be afraid to holler out an answer. You can stop me and raise your hand and ask a question at any time, and don't be shy about getting up and getting more snacks at any time. You're not going to get in the way or bother anybody. Okay, let's see. 23. Sorry, not 23. 34. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. So Jesus is giving a public address. It's his final public address. His first one was on the Sermon on the Mount back in Matthew 5. His final one is here in the temple. His final one is a rebuke of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and they are the perpetual teachers of this false religion that Jesus is so against. And he's finishing up his message, and he was giving it to them for the whole chapter, calling them names, giving them woes. I mean, Jesus was very rough with these guys. In verse 34, Jesus said that he sends them prophets. So here's the question. Who called and sent the prophet Isaiah? It's not a trick question. Jesus did. Who called and sent the prophet Jeremiah? Jesus did. He said, Behold, I send unto you prophets. Now, do you understand that when Jesus says that he sent prophets, that is a declaration of who he is? He is not just some other prophet. He is God. This did not make the Pharisees and the Sadducees happy. Jesus said that he sent three groups: prophets, wise men, and scribes. Now, I'm not going to get into those three groups right now, other than to mention that he sent more than just prophets to the nation of Israel. What did they, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, do to the prophets, wise men, and scribes? They killed them. That's what they did. They killed them. But they also crucified him. Now, think with me. Jesus saying that they crucified the prophets, what does that imply? Jesus is going to be crucified, but that's not what he's getting at. Jesus saying that you crucified the prophets. Let me ask you this. In those days, how did the Pharisees and Sadducees crucify someone? Nope. They didn't. So stoning was the method of execution for the nation of Israel given by God as a commandment in the Old Testament. That's how they were supposed to execute capital criminals. Why do they not stone Jesus? It was the Pharisees and the Sadducees who wanted him dead. Why didn't they stone him? MacArthur? That's right. The Romans said they could not. So I'm not going to go into the Bible study about it, but if you want to write it down in your notes and look it up later on your own, look up the scepter of Israel. The Romans came in and removed the scepter from Israel. That was their authority to reign and rule over their own country as sovereigns, which allowed them to execute capital criminals. The Romans came in and said, nope, no more. If you want to execute a capital criminal, you got to go through our courts. So what does that imply? The Pharisees and the Sadducees are guilty of crucifying the prophets. That means that they worked hand in glove with the pagan, Gentile, Roman government to get these prophets killed. The Jews never crucified anyone. They had to go through Roman courts to do it. That's why Jesus had to stand trial before governors and kings. That's why Paul had to stand trial before governors and kings. Jesus didn't do a king. He was in front of a governor. Okay, also in verse 34, it says, in the synagogues they would scourge them. Do you know that that is corporal punishment with a whip? Says they also pursued those prophets from city to city. They wouldn't just run them out of town. They would follow them. They would pursue them. They would hunt them down. Do you remember that's what they did to Paul in the book of Acts when Paul was going around on his missionary journey? He would go to the synagogue. He would preach Jesus. Sometimes it went well. More often than not, it didn't go real well. Sometimes they would run him out of town under threat of death. And sometimes they followed him to the next town, and sometimes they killed him. You heard me right. Sometimes, meaning more than once. That's what the Bible says. They did the same thing to these prophets. And we read that the children of the devil persecute the children of God. Jesus called the Pharisees and the Sadducees the children of the devil in John chapter 8, verse 44. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. Verse 35. Who are the righteous who were slain? Jesus says that upon you, talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees, all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, it's going to be on your hands. Who are the righteous he's talking about here? Again, they were the prophets. He gives two names. He says from Abel to Zacharias. That's like saying from A to Z. That's the way that we would say it. Do you know that Abel was the first guy murdered in the Bible? Abel was one of two sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. Abel was a prophet. Do you know who Zacharias was? He was one of the last prophets in the Old Testament. There were time periods in the Old Testament. The last time period was when the nation of Israel left Babylon and went back to Israel. They rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the city, and after the second temple was built, God sent them several prophets. We call them post-exile prophets. Zacharias was one of the last ones, and the way the Bible reads, it sounds like he was the last prophet killed by the nation of Israel prior to the 400-year period of silence and the beginning of what we call the New Testament when Jesus is born. Jesus was assigning the guilt of the murder of every prophet in the Old Testament to the scribes and Pharisees standing in front of him. Now, more accurately, we could probably say that Jesus was saying, you guys are in the group of all the bad guys that killed all the prophets. That's the group that you're in. We have the good guys over here. You're not in that group. And we have the bad guys who are murderers who think they're good guys, and that's who you are. The Pharisees and Sadducees were not happy with this message. Verse 36. Here Jesus shifts gears and tells them what they are going to endure because of their rejection of Messiah. He's saying, these are all the things, get ready. In the next couple verses, these are the things that are going to come upon you and fall on your head because of your rejection of Messiah. Verse 37. The city and the temple and the people living in the city are going to get hit with the wrath of God. But not only the city of Jerusalem, all Israel. See, Jesus is using what's called a synecdoche. It's a literary device where you use something specific to describe the general. So he's saying Jerusalem is going to get hit with this, but really the entire nation of Israel gets punished for rejecting the Messiah. Because they rejected God's message and they killed the prophets that brought the message, they're in trouble. And the final prophet is standing in front of them, and they have already rejected him. And by the end of the week, they're going to be guilty of killing him. Now, Jesus says that he would have taken them back any time if they would have just turned to him. They would not. That's what it says. It doesn't say they could not. Do you know how long-suffering God is? It seems like it. It seems like eternally. If it's not, boy, it's got to be close. How about this? Can we agree that God is more long-suffering than any of us here? When we read through the wickedness that God endures of the people he calls his children again and again, I don't have time to get into all the different analogies and metaphors that the Lord uses. But he is always right there. Even now, after telling the Sadducees and Pharisees that they're guilty of the blood of every prophet in the Bible, Jesus says, hey, I would have taken you right back, like a mama hen with chicks under her wing. But you would not. He didn't say you're past the point of being able to repent and get right. He says, I was willing to do it. They had the opportunity, they would not turn. In verse 38, Jerusalem will be empty and Israel, meaning the land, will be empty. And this happens roughly 35 years after the crucifixion of Christ, in 70 AD, when the Romans come in, lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and destroy everything. And in verse 39, when Jesus leaves, they will not see him again until they shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Does anyone know where that verse comes from? What's Jesus quoting? Very good, Carol. Psalm 118. Stay out of my preaching. Oh, you got to study Bible. Oh, it's as bad as using a smartphone. That's exactly it, Psalm 118. Does anyone know when the other time they were all supposed to yell and recite Psalm 118? Everyone was supposed to quote Psalm 118 when? Just a couple days ago. Mac? when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem riding on a donkey. They were supposed to quote Psalm 118 as they accepted him as Messiah. Do you understand that Jesus is predicting, he's making a prophecy saying, I'm going to leave, I'm not coming back until you receive me as Messiah. That's the prophecy. So, I have two questions for you. Number one, when does Jesus leave? And number two, when is he coming back? Jesus, you don't have to pay attention to everything on this timeline. It's a little busy. I just want you to notice a couple of things. Okay, number one, what we want to notice is the cross right here. That is the crucifixion. And what we want to notice is that shortly after the crucifixion, we have the ascension. Just a little over 40 days after the crucifixion, Jesus ascends into heaven. And that's where he is right now, waiting for a certain day. Greg, you got a question?
Is this going to be useful for the future?
Oh, yeah.
Can you
Email it to you? 100%. Wash, write that down. Yep. So, Jesus' ascension, that's when he leaves. He says, I'm not coming back until you, speaking to, remember, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the nation of Israel as a whole, until you say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, meaning all the Jews recognize Jesus as Messiah. When does that happen? That happens right here. Whoops. That happens right here. After the 70th week of Daniel, Jesus comes back, and as we read in Romans chapter, I believe it was 12, when Paul says that every Jew on earth will be saved, and that happens on one day, when they accept Jesus as Messiah. The prophecy comes from Hosea chapter 5. I don't have time to get into every one of these verses and put them up there. You got to write them down and do your own homework. Okay, we'll get to them sooner or later. But you got to understand that the prophet Hosea says that you guys are going to go through a terrible affliction, and in that affliction you are going to turn and recognize Messiah, and that is when you will call on him. And that is the great tribulation that's going to take place in the second half of the 7-year period we call the 70th week of Daniel. And at the end of it, what stops that 70th week is when the nation of Israel, just like the entire nation of Israel, corporately rejected Messiah when he rode into town on a donkey, and they did not greet him as king. At the same time, they are going to receive him as Savior. Gonna leave that right there, and we'll get back to it. Any questions? I know that's a lot. Yeah, folks, a lot of you are doing great. You really are. You might not think you're doing great. You are doing great. I know that a lot of folks here have very little to no church experience or experience with the Bible. And coming to this church, you just got to sit there and drink from a fire hose. I get it. That's fine. Okay, just paddle as much as you can, keep your head above water, learn everything you can. It will start to come. But we are not going to be the church that teaches down to the level of the lowest common denominator. There's plenty of churches like that. Okay, we try to give you a, I don't know, PhD level course in Christianity and the Bible. And you're doing great. So when I say something and you're like, I don't know what that phrase means, don't worry about it. Okay, you're not the only one. Did someone have a question? I thought there was a hand up. We got two, Tom and then Mason.
when he rides in on a donkey and all shouting Hosanna in the highest, who are they that are shouting that recognize him?
Okay, great question. So the question was, when Jesus does ride in on a donkey, there is a group that is shouting exactly Psalm 118 and blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Who is that group? So what happens, I'm not going to get there. What happens is that people from all over the nation of Israel are entering Jerusalem for the feast day that's coming up, Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Jesus is traveling in from the Mount of Olives, which is on the east, and he is traveling west down this hill, sees the temple, and enters in at the east gate. At the time, the disciples go and they just grab the donkey like they were instructed. So we know the disciples were there. Were there more of the disciples than just the 12? Possibly. But we know for a fact there were lots of strangers, because literally the city is being filled with millions of people. My belief, which is not scripture, but I think it's the way that the Bible reads, is that Jesus was traveling in, and those that were around him, I believe, were strangers. They did not know what was going on, but they saw Jesus, they saw him on the donkey, and I believe the Spirit was moving amongst them, and they recognized what was going on in I will call it a supernatural fashion, okay? And they saw, holy cow, this is it. Okay, Messiah is here, donkey. This is you got it. This is the prophecy. It's coming true. And I think it was just in the proximity of Jesus while this is happening, they were caught up in it and they recognized it. And the Bible uses the term many times, God opens the eyes, right, of the blind, and they see something the rest don't see. And then what happens is Jesus comes around the corner, okay, and if you get out a map of the Mount of Olives, you see that you have to go around the mountain, and when you come around the mountain, there's Jerusalem. And when he gets there, Jesus stops and he weeps. And he weeps because the entire nation of Israel was supposed to be there waiting to quote Psalm 118 and welcome him as king, and they weren't. The Pharisees and the Sadducees that were there tried to throw some cold water on the whole thing, and they told them, oh, you need to get your folks here to stop singing that. That's not okay. The reason it wasn't okay is because what they are saying is, this guy is Messiah. We're not allowed to say that. That's bad. Now, you can say it if it is Messiah. You can't say it if it's not. They didn't think Jesus was Messiah, so he wanted them to shut up, or they wanted the followers of Jesus that were excited to shut up, and Jesus said, if these guys don't sing, the rocks would cry out. I believe that, again, that was just God moving so that the rocks didn't have to cry out. But I might be wrong. But again, even though, and we have to remember this, we say many times, you'll hear me say from this pulpit, the nation of Israel rejected Jesus. The nation of Israel did not accept him as Messiah. That is true. Were there individual Jews in the nation of Israel that did accept him as Messiah? Absolutely. There were big crowds of people that definitely thought, this is the guy. He's more than just a prophet. This is the guy. And also, I think that went up and down. We even see that with the 12, where in one chapter they're convinced, oh, this is the guy. And then 2 chapters later, they don't understand what he's talking about. And it seems like they're kind of in a low where they're like, well, I don't know. Is he really the guy, or is it just a prophet that we're hanging out with? So they seem to go back and forth. And then at the cross, how many of them thought he was Messiah? 1. Now, we don't know, but only 1 was there. Good question. Mason, go ahead.
So in 34, 35, he's invading
You got it. I agree. I don't think so, mostly because you got to remember, so the question was, is he trying to say that they are of the lineage of Cain? So short answer is no, because what you got to remember is there's a bottleneck, and that bottleneck is at Noah. So after Cain and Abel, right, we have this family tree that spreads out, and then it bottlenecks at Noah. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Only Shem was the one that was of the line that produced Abraham, and then it bottlenecks again. So now the nation of Israel comes from Abraham, and then it goes to Jacob, and then it goes to the 12 tribes. So No. Cain was definitely someone that was not of the lineage that went all the way through to Noah, to Shem, to Abraham, to Jacob, and to the 12. Does that help? I don't know if that was all the way around. But my point is, it's only that family tree that connects Adam, Noah, Shem, Abraham, Jacob, that would be the children of Israel. So my point is, the Pharisees and the Sadducees could not have been anywhere outside of that specific family tree that made up the nation of Israel. Good question. I don't know how well I answered it. Okay, so okay, now we are going to move over to our introduction. That's not it. Yeah, don't go there, Wash. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to move into the second half of the evening, where we're going to go over to the introduction of Hanukkah. And we're going to jump into this. We definitely went late. We're going to go long, so let's see how this goes. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay, so tonight and next week, I'm going to teach you what Hanukkah is, where it came from, and how you can celebrate it. This year, I was asked by several people to teach practical lessons on the feast days, and how, if you're a Christian living in America today, how you could maybe incorporate them into your home and into your family, and we've been doing that. And please understand, Hanukkah is not a feast day. People ask me that all the time. Nope, there are 7 feast days. They are listed in Leviticus chapter 23. Hanukkah is not one of them. Hanukkah came around 165 BC. Moses came down Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments back in about 1500 BC. So Hanukkah is not a feast day. However, it is a holiday. So, why do we learn about Hanukkah and talk about it, and why do the Hayes family celebrate it? Well, we celebrate it for several reasons. Number one, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. There it is. He did, and it's in the Bible. Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, right? We always hear about we want to be more like Jesus. All right, well, we're doing something Jesus did. Number two, Hanukkah is an amazing story of the miracles of the God that I worship. As a Christian today, I don't think of Hanukkah as a holiday for the Jews from 165 BC. I think of it as a miracle by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Are we all clear that that's the God that you all worship? Okay. So when he did miracles prior to Jesus being born, they were still amazing. When he did miracles back in Egypt with the 10 plagues and the Passover and the Red Sea, those were still amazing. I, as a Christian today, am not at odds with Israel and Judaism. None of us should be. I am patiently waiting for the day when they recognize Jesus as Messiah, and then we can all worship him together. That's going to be the single greatest day of adding people to the church. In one day, we're going to see more people saved than at any single day in Earth's history, when the nation of Israel recognizes we were wrong, we nailed him to a cross, and we recognize that he is Messiah, and our salvation is through him. So Hanukkah is a celebration of the miracle of your God. So let's start with the story of Hanukkah, and we will go over a bunch of Bible, and we will also have some practical things that you and your family can do at home if you want to remember and celebrate this time. And if you don't, that's fine. I'm not going to think any less of you. Okay, you don't have to be like Patrick Hayes to exist at this church or to get along. It's fine. Does anyone know what the word Hanukkah means? That's a good guess, Carol. It is not. Although Hanukkah is the festival of lights, that's not what Hanukkah means. Hebrew word. Think back to your training. It's okay. The word Hanukkah is the word for dedication. Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the second temple. What we need to do for Hanukkah to make sense at all is we need to go over a timeline and a little bit of history of the temples in Israel. We will start with what the temple is and what it is for. So when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he carried with him 2 stone tablets, the 10 Commandments. What a lot of folks don't understand is that he also carried with him under his arm a set of engineered drawings, we would call blueprints. And those blueprints were how to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the precursor to the temple. The tabernacle was a tent that they set up in the wilderness for the Levitical priests to perform their sacrifices and all of their duties. So we have to remember that the nation of Israel was required to perform sacrifices, animal sacrifices. They had daily sacrifices, they had weekly sacrifices, they had yearly sacrifices, and these sacrifices took place in the tabernacle. Each one of the 7 feast days was centered around the tabernacle. By the way, tabernacle, it's a word for tent or temporary dwelling. That's what it means. And they would set this up. I got a model of a tabernacle right here if you want to come and see it when we're done. They would pack it up and they would take it with them, and when God told them to stop, they would stop and they would set it up and they would set up their camp. And then when God told them to move again, they'd pack it up and they'd move. Each one of the feast days is centered around the tabernacle. Now, the nation of Israel first set up the tabernacle shortly after Moses came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments back in 1450 BC. About 500 years later, King Solomon built the first brick and mortar temple. And that temple was in the city of Jerusalem. And we're going to get there in a minute. The tabernacle was the temporary, transportable temple in the wilderness while the nation of Israel wandered around the wilderness for 40 years prior to getting into the promised land. Any questions so far? Well, I didn't draw it, Greg, so I'm not sure what the artist's rendering was, but the light shooting out of the back of the temple, I'm going to show you what was back there in a minute in this room. So we believe that was the glory of the Lord. Yeah, but I don't know. Bible doesn't talk about light shooting out of the tabernacle, just so we're clear. That is not a photograph of the tabernacle. That is a drawing. So it is not a Google image. So thank you, now we're clear. Okay, so here is a picture of the tabernacle. Now we are looking down from above, and I want you to understand the parts and the pieces and how this all worked. This was the temple in the wilderness that Moses and Aaron used while the nation of Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. And this is a simpler drawing than the temple. When the temple was built by Solomon, it was much bigger than just this. They added on. And then there was a second temple built later, and that was added on to and made even bigger. And then that second temple had a remodel about 30 years before Jesus was born, and it was made bigger still. We're going to get to all of that. The components and the areas are the same in the tabernacle in the wilderness and drawn on the screen here as they were in the temple. Any questions so far? I'm going to stop and ask if you have questions a lot, because I know we're going over a ton of stuff and most of us have never learned about this before, and that's fine. If usually in a church, if you want to put people to sleep, you just get on a lesson about the temple. Yes?
Required to set it up so that the front or the outer courtyard faced east?
They did. They had to set it up just like that. So the entrance was on the east, face the east. Yep. Okay, so the temple is made, or sorry, Greg. Yeah, give it to me.
Is that the significance of Jesus entering the east gate when he returned?
So the question was, is that significant, or is it related to Jesus entering the east gate of the temple like he did in Matthew when he rode in on the donkey, and how he's going to do it with his second coming? I have never thought about that before, Greg, but I think that's an obvious way to look at it. Don't you think? Makes sense to me. Yeah. So I love the idea. So that could be, so folks, you got to remember, do we all know how prophecy works in the Hebrew model? It's different than in the Greek model. In the Greek model, we look at prophecy as a prediction and then a fulfillment of that prediction. That's how we look at prophecy. The Hebrew model of prophecy is pattern. So you see the same thing again and again and again, and we believe that it will happen in the future in that same way. That's the Hebrew model of prophecy. So the door of the tabernacle being on the east could absolutely be considered a prophecy of the first and second coming of Messiah. So high five, Greg. Mark him down for 5 gold stars. Okay, so in the temple, and I'm going to use the term temple and tabernacle, and I'm going to mix them up all the time, so just bear with me. We're talking about the tabernacle, but the temple's the same. The temple is made up of 3 areas. You have the outer courtyard. That outer courtyard contains the altar of sacrifice and the laver. Now, the outer courtyard was open to the sky. So when you burned an animal at the altar of sacrifice, the smoke just went up. It wasn't contained in anything, as you can see here. Next, you have 2 areas that are enclosed rooms. You enter the holy place again from the east. Then you can walk through that room to the most holy place, or what we call the Holy of Holies. The holy place contains 3 items: the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the menorah. Now, I brought with me a menorah. This is a menorah. A menorah is a type of candelabra. It is a 7-branched candlestick. The menorah in the temple has 7 branches, holds 7. They didn't actually hold candles, it was an oil lamp. But understand, this is a menorah. Different from a Hanukkah, sometimes incorrectly called a Hanukkah menorah. A Hanukkah has 9 candles. Why? For the 8 days of Hanukkah, obviously. That was a joke. Now, the Holy of Holies contains 2 items, and only 2 items. It contains the Ark of the Covenant. Has anyone seen Indiana Jones' Raiders of the Lost Ark? There you go. That was the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant is a wooden box overlaid with gold. It also contains, the Holy of Holies also contains the mercy seat. The mercy seat was the lid that went on the Ark of the Covenant, and that was solid gold. Here is the temple with all the components. Yes, I will email you that picture. Any questions? Okay. Sacrifices were performed daily, weekly, and yearly in the temple on the altar of sacrifice. In the holy place, the menorah was lit daily. So it was filled with oil and lit every day. The altar of incense had incense burned on it twice a day, and the table of showbread had the bread replaced once a week. Anyone know the day of the week it was replaced? It was on Saturday. It was the Sabbath day. Yep. In the holy place, or I'm sorry, I should say in the Holy of Holies, it is only ever occupied by one person on one day a year. And that was the high priest who would occupy it on Yom Kippur. And he only went in there after great ceremonial preparation. To give you an idea, God said that he dwelled, he lived, he sat on the mercy seat. On the lid of the Ark of the Covenant was God. And to go into the Holy of Holies, you had to go through a great amount of ceremonial preparation. And do you know what happened if you did any of that preparation wrong? You died. Do you know that on the high priest's clothing they had bells? And the priests on Yom Kippur would sit outside the Holy of Holies listening in case the bells stopped. They tied a rope to the body of the high priest. So if the bells stopped jingling and jangling, we could pull his dead body out. To stand in the presence of God, you needed to be as perfect as a human could get. And the high priest, he went in there, he did what he was supposed to do, and he left. There was no hanging out, there was no dilly-dallying, because you did not want to mess up. Any questions?
What were the tasks when you went into that?
He had to sprinkle blood on some stuff. He had to bring a sacrifice in. He had, I am not equipped to answer the question of all the specifics, but I could look it up, or I can give you a couple chapters in Leviticus that outline it. But I'd have to take a look. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So we must understand just how important this building is to the religion of Judaism and the life of all the Jews living in Israel. If we don't, Hanukkah is not going to mean anything and the story is not going to be impressive. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 16 and 17, we read, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, and in the feast of weeks, that's Pentecost, and in the feast of tabernacles, that's Sukkot. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. So every man, 3 times a year, would go down to Jerusalem to worship God and participate in the feast days. Often your whole family would go. But if you were looking after elderly parents, or if maybe your wife was pregnant or had a nursing baby, maybe, people would stay home. But if it was possible, everyone would go, and it was a big time of celebration. It was a time everybody looked forward to. The feast days were not only a party, they were a party with your friends and your family and lots of good food, and they were centered around God. They were amazing times. Lots of singing. Now, to get to Jerusalem every year at those times, you didn't book a flight. You walked. Do you understand that you would plan your yearly calendar around these times? The temple and those events encouraged Jews not to move too far away from Jerusalem. Because if you had to go back there 3 times a year, you didn't want to live on the other side of the Mediterranean. It kept the people near the land. Remember that the covenant God had with Abraham in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 and in Genesis 18 was not just with the nation of Israel. It was with the nation of Israel and with the land. The people were tied to the land. Any questions? Things to do. If you want to get into Hanukkah at your home, you can build a model of the temple or the tabernacle. You can teach your kids about it. You can get and print off coloring pages about the temple and the tabernacle, and you can teach your kids about it. It's part of the story, and it needs to be special. Now, let's go over a timeline, and then we'll be done, and we'll pick it up next Friday for part 2. Yes, I'll email this off as well. To give you a reference, the cross on the timeline was when Jesus was crucified. So let's take a look at this timeline and get our bearings here. All these dates were taken from the book James Ussher's The Annals of the World. It's the thickest, tallest book on my bookshelf over there. And if you are, or if you want to be a serious student of the Bible, you have to have that book. With that being said, you don't need to buy a copy of the book. You literally just have to type into Google James Ussher, Annals of the World, PDF, and you can go to a website where all 2,000 pages of the PDF are there, and they're keyword searchable. And it is a chronology of world history with the Bible at the center. So if you're wondering the year that King David was born, or the year that the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, or the year that whatever happened, it's all in there. It's amazing. James Ussher is the author, Annals of the World, A-N-N-A-L-S, Annals of the World. It's a super helpful tool for any Bible scholar, any Bible teacher, anyone wanting to, dig deeper. Okay, on this timeline, let's focus on this timeline for a second. On the left, in yellow, in 1451 BC, the prophet Moses dies. When Moses dies, he is buried by God outside of the promised land. This event ends the book of Deuteronomy and thus the Torah, what we would call our Old Testament, or the 5 books of Moses, or in the Greek, the Pentateuch. Joshua, the protege of Moses, then takes up the mantle and leads the nation of Israel into the promised land, starting with the 6th book in the Bible, called Joshua. Does anyone know how you pronounce the name of Joshua in Hebrew? We're getting there. So it is Yeshua, or Yehoshua, which means God is our salvation. The Greek pronounced it Jesus, and the English, today, we would pronounce the Greek name as Jesus. I say all that to say this. Another name for the book of Joshua is the book of Jesus. And when you recognize that, the next time you read through that book, a whole bunch of stuff is going to stand out. In 1063 BC, in the lower left corner of the timeline, there in pink, David is anointed king in Bethlehem. We can read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 16. Both Jesus and King David were born in the little town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread. In 1012 BC, that's in the bottom of the timeline in green. No, I skipped one. In 1046 BC, in red, the house of David is built in Jerusalem. And in 1012 BC, the foundation of the first temple was laid. It was built in Jerusalem. The temple was completed in 1005 BC, and it was dedicated the following year. Now, prior to this, the nation of Israel, when they first moved into the Promised Land, when Joshua crossed the river, the Jordan River, and invaded Jericho, and the nation of Israel went through the Canaan land and took over, they set up the tabernacle in the city of where? You know, one of the games we were going to play was Bible trivia. It was going to be like Bible Jeopardy. I had a whole thing. I was going to put on the suit, and it was going to be really cool. And I just don't know if we can do this anymore. I'm going to have to go over my questions again. City of Shiloh. So the city of Shiloh. Do you want to win that giant Kit Kat over there? Does anyone want to win that? It's like 12 pounds. You should want to win it. Write down Shiloh. Okay, Shiloh's about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. They set up the tabernacle in Shiloh, and they left it there, and that's where it remained until the temple was built in Jerusalem, and then they only used the temple, and they no longer used the tabernacle. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Now, if you're going to remember any date in the Bible, this is one you got to remember. 586 BC, the first temple was destroyed. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. They took all the Jews away captive to Babylon, and they remained in Babylon for a period of 70 years. Does anyone know the date that the first temple was destroyed? Now, I don't expect anyone to know this. No, that's the year. No, you guys are good. Yeah, you're like, Patrick, it's on the screen. What is 586? What is 586? Right? You pose it as a question. That was a Jeopardy joke. Forget it. Okay. Yes, you got the year right. What was the date? It's okay. It was not. Okay, now, the date, what do I need? Do I need a month and day from the Gregorian calendar? Nope, that ain't going to help us any. Okay, so the first temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av. You say, what does that mean? Okay, I'm going to tell you. So you can see the inner circle here is the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar that we use. The outer circle are the 12 months of God's calendar that he gives us in the Bible. Now again, I will email this to everybody. Av is the 5th month in the Bible calendar. The 9th day of the 5th month was when the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. You say, Patrick, what does that mean to me? There were 4 major catastrophes for the nation of Israel that all took place on the 9th of Av. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Roughly, a little over 600 years later, the second temple was destroyed by Titus Vespasian, general of the Roman army with 4 Roman legions. Guess what the date was? It was the 9th of Av. God did that to make sure everyone on earth knew it was his hand of judgment. And that's why it was destroyed. There are 2 more major events in the Bible that happened on the 9th of Av through history. I'll let you look that up and lose some sleep tonight and give you something to do this weekend. Any questions? Okay, here is the map of the Middle East. Israel is the country in blue over here, and the yellow dot is Jerusalem. That's the capital city. And the large purple country, which is labeled Iraq, is present-day Iraq, and the yellow dot is the city of Baghdad, and the orange dot below that is the city of Babylon. There are currently archaeological ruins there. In 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, they brought the Jews here to Babylon. Any questions? Here is our next timeline to tell the next portion of the story with the temple. So what happens is the Persian Empire invades Babylonia, the nation of Babylon, who occupied the majority of the world at the time. The Persian Empire invades the nation of Babylon in 539 BC. It is not on the timeline. That same year, they take over the capital city of Babylon. Now, if for some reason all of this electronic stuff just fails and my notes are gone and I don't know what to preach on, someone raise your hand and say, tell us about when the Persians took over Babylon, because it is one of the coolest stories in the entire Bible. Okay? I'm not going to do it now. When the Persians took over Babylon, the Jewish slaves in Babylon were then allowed to return to their country. That happened in 536 BC, which is in the bottom center of the timeline in orange. When they go back to Jerusalem, the altar and the sacrifices resume. Now, they did not build a temple, but they built the altar of sacrifice in the spot where it was supposed to be built, and they resumed the sacrifices. You can read about that in Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. In the following year, in 535 BC, the foundation of the temple was laid. The second temple was completed in 516 BC, and it was dedicated the following year, and you can read about that in the book of Ezra, chapter 3, verses 18 to 13. And there's such a beautiful, touching verse in that chapter, because out of all that went back to Jerusalem to take back the land that God had for them, there were several very old men who remembered the first temple. And they saw the foundation laid, and they saw the sacrifices begin, and they saw the second temple built, and it brought them to tears to think that they got to see God restore the temple and the sacrifices. That second temple, which we should call the temple of Zerubbabel, is often mistakenly called Herod's temple. Herod being the bad guy from the New Testament and the Gospels. And what Herod did was he remodeled the second temple around 20 BC, and therefore, he didn't literally stick his name on it, but it was, called Herod's temple. The second temple was the temple that Jesus was taken to as a baby. About 40 days, somewhere in there after Jesus was born, he was taken to the temple, and he was dedicated there. It was the same temple that Jesus was teaching at in Matthew 23, and it was the same temple that Jesus could see while he hung on the cross. And in 70 AD, in the top center of the timeline, the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed when General Titus Vespasian traveled to Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions. He laid siege to the city. It was leading up to the time of Passover. So all of Israel was going there. And although they surrounded the city, they kept letting everyone in. But they didn't let anyone out. And when they broke down the walls, they killed hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. They destroyed the temple, and they lit the city on fire. There has not been a temple in Jerusalem since. Now, what's interesting is that we know a third temple will be built sometime in the future. The Bible tells us that in the end times, the Antichrist will stand up in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, and will cause the sacrifices to stop. Well, if he is going to stand in a temple, then a temple must be built. Little problem. There's a building in the way right now. It's a mosque, the Dome of the Rock. So that's going to have to go. Exciting times we're living in, because the folks associated with the Dome of the Rock ain't going to be too happy when it has to leave. Yeah. Any questions? Give it to me.
The timeline shows that it looks like the temple was destroyed and go back to Israel. 586, it looks like it was destroyed, the temple, the first temple was destroyed.
Yes.
It looked like it was starting to get that rebuilt in 560 years.
Yes.
They captivity 70.
That's a great question. Let me see if I can pull up my... Nope, that's okay. Let me see. No. Let me, it's here. Here we go. Bada bing. Look at how fat. Look at technology is amazing. Okay. So Greg pointed out something that is a very sharp catch. Okay. The dates are tricky because we're saying, well, wait a minute, but when the temple was destroyed and when it was rebuilt wasn't 70 years, and you said that they were in captivity 70 years. Here's how it works. When we go back and read in 2 Kings about the Babylonian invasion into Israel, the way it works is that the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem 3 times. The first time they lay siege to Jerusalem is in 605 BC. And what they do is they take several people captive, and they take several of the things of the temple, the gold and the precious stuff, and they head on back to Babylon. That begins a time period that we call the servitude of the nations. So the servitude of the nations starts in 605 BC. That is a 70-year period which ends with the decree of Cyrus, who gives the Jews permission to go back and rebuild the temple, and we read about that in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. Now what happens is that in the first siege, that was terrible. During the first siege, we're just going to give up there. During siege number 1, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the general of Babylon, he was not the king at the time, he sets up a vassal king. So the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem were still allowed to operate as a colony of Babylon. And there is a Jewish king within the lineage of the kings of Judah. Even though we removed the existing king, he put in another Jewish king and said, now you all behave and you pay us tribute, and we're going to take a bunch of slaves and we're going to leave, and you guys behave. They did not behave. They rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar comes back, and he comes back in 597 for siege number 2. And this is all written in 2 Kings, in the last 2 chapters of the book of 2 Kings. Removes the second king, sets up another vassal king who is Jewish in the line of Judah, takes more people prisoner, and leaves again. The nation of Israel rebels a second time. Nebuchadnezzar marches all the way back to Jerusalem. By this point, he's had a belly full and he is done with it. He destroys the wall, destroys the city, destroys the temple, and takes everyone captive and marches back to Babylon. And that happened in siege number 3, which was 586 BC, which was the destruction of the temple. And that started a period that we call the desolation of Jerusalem, which was also a 70-year period. That 70-year period ends with the decree of Artaxerxes, Launus Germanus, the Persian king, to go back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Prior to the city being built, they had already built the altar and were performing sacrifices there. So there are 2 70-year periods which are coterminous. One is the desolation of Jerusalem, the other is the servitude of the nations, and they overlap. That is the reason for the dates that don't line up the way we think they would. So, in 605 BC, that was when Daniel was taken away in the first siege brought to Babylon. During the second siege, the prophet Ezekiel was taken away. And during the third siege, they destroy the temple in 586 BC. Does that help? I was. I mean, I had the thing drawn up and everything. Honestly, Greg, thank you. I've been waiting to pull that baby out for months. So I finally got to use that picture. An extra 5 gold stars for Greg. Okay, good. Any other questions? Go ahead. Try playing Stump the Pastor. I dare you. Okay, Carol, what you got?
When they rebuild the temple the second time, will there be an Ark of the Covenant? Is there an Ark of the Covenant?
Okay, question was, when they build the temple the third time, will there be an Ark of the Covenant? Yes and no. So, and you can go home and do your homework with this one. When you go to 2 Kings, and I'm not going to turn there. When you go to 2 Kings and you read about the first siege of the Babylonians, what you find out is that they write down a list of all the things that the Babylonians steal from the temple and take away. And every single item on that list exists when Moses tells them what to put in the temple, except for one item. The Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat are not on the list of the items stolen by the Babylonians, which leads us to believe that they hid their most precious item when the siege took place, or prior to it coming, knowing that it was coming and they know they needed to protect it. So, in the third temple, one of those 2 items is present, and that is, yes, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat are going to show up again. And then, believe it or not, it's not on here, there's going to be a 4th temple. The 4th temple will be built during the millennial reign. The millennial reign, the millennial reign is the 1,000-year period that takes place. This is bad. Okay? The 1,000-year period that takes place at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. In the millennial reign, a 4th temple will be built. That 4th temple is described in the book of Ezekiel, and that temple is so wildly different from the first 3 that were identical in measurements, in dimensions, and everything, that the rabbis actually thought that they were not going to include it in the Bible because it was so different from the tabernacle and the first 2 temples. But they said, no, this comes from the prophet Ezekiel, it is from God, and we believe that when Moses and Elijah return, they will sort out how this temple is going to be built and how we're going to work in it. Because they had no idea how it was going to work. During the 4th temple in the millennial reign, the 1,000-year period, the mercy seat is there. The ark is not. I don't know why. I have things that I think, but it's also like 9 o'clock and I'm pretty sure everyone wants to leave, so I don't know if I'm going to get into that. Now, if you want some homework, go home and figure out where in the book of Acts the Ark of the Covenant is. Because it's explained in the book of Acts, where the Ark of the Covenant is hidden today. And if you want me to go over it, I'll be happy to, but I'm not going to do that now. Last chance for questions. You guys were wonderful. Thank you for letting me go late. It'll make next week and the rest of the story of Hanukkah go much more quickly and easily. Yeah, well, not quickly, easily. Okay, you guys were wonderful. Let's have a word of prayer and we will be dismissed. Rick, would you be so kind as to close us in a word of prayer?